might not have heard Viola Liuzzo's name before today, but I wanted you to hear her story.
In 1965, on a dark Alabama highway, a young mother of 5 vanished after a historic march for equality. Hours later, her car was found smashed into a wooden fence, its headlights still blazing, a scene that shocked the nation. This documentary tells the true story of Viola Liuzzo, a Detroit housewife who left her everyday life, work, and family to support the march from Selma to Montgomery. She was not a politician, a social activist, or a prominent activist. She was an ordinary woman who made an extraordinary decision and paid the ultimate price for it. If you enjoy true investigative stories, courtroom dramas, and historically accurate crimes told with respect and context, this episode is for you. Dear viewers, in the next video releases you will find very intriguing and confusing cases, and in order not to miss them, be sure to subscribe to the channel and please like the video. Viola Liuzzo was born in 1925 in a small California town and spent her childhood in Pennsylvania, in a family with little money and little room for dreams. Those early years rarely surface in the memories of her family, because Viola herself rarely liked to talk about them. The modest home, frequent moves, and strict austerity, all of this was the background, not the essence of her character. She learned early on that support must always come from within, and that a person is shaped not by circumstances, but by the choices they make as an adult. That's why, when talking about herself, she much more often recalled her adult years, work, education, family life, and that inner need to make the world around her at least a little more just. When the family moved to the South, life was far from carefree. Her parents couldn't provide their daughter with stability, and Viola quickly matured. But once she reached the age where she could make her own decisions, she began to pick up a pace that would later surprise even those who had known her for many years. She wasn't quiet or inconspicuous. On the contrary, she early displayed the energy of someone who wasn't prepared to wait for life to take shape. In her 20s, she worked actively, trying out various roles, and each of these experiences helped her better understand the path she wanted to take in life. On the threshold of adulthood, Viola developed what would become her primary guideline, a desire to learn and develop, despite the lack of outside support. She enrolled at Wayne State University in Detroit, already a young mother and wife. This decision wasn't easy. Her studies required time that was always in short supply, her husband held several jobs, and her young children needed constant attention. But it was during these years that the part of Viola's personality that would later become defining emerged. The ability to balance domestic responsibilities, professional goals, and moral convictions without favoring one over the other. From an early age, Viola worked as a secretary, administrator, office assistant, anywhere that required discipline and the ability to maintain order. She didn't aspire to prestigious positions or dream of a traditional career. She was interested in something else. She wanted to be useful. She wanted her work to matter. And whenever she encountered injustice, at work, in everyday life, in the public sphere, she responded in a unique way, not with harsh words or conflict, but with action. If she could help someone, protect someone in a difficult situation, or lend a shoulder to cry on, she did so without hesitation. Her marriage to Anthony Liuzzo became an important support system. He worked for the Teamsters Union, a calm, level-headed man who didn't seek publicity. At first glance, they were very different. She was emotional and impetuous. He was more inward-looking and family-oriented. But their contrasting personalities created a surprisingly harmonious couple. Together they built a home that was always full of children, guests, conversations, and plans. Viola gave birth to 5 children, and no one she knew could understand how she managed to juggle family, school, and work. For her, motherhood wasn't a completely consuming role. She viewed it as part of a broader purpose, to be a person who creates comfort and justice around herself. She wasn't afraid to change jobs when she felt she'd reached her limit, or when the atmosphere in her team no longer aligned with her beliefs. She wasn't afraid to challenge her superiors when she believed someone's rights were being violated. But she did all of this calmly, almost gently, with a quiet intensity that seemed to stem from the conviction that the world can be changed if you're not afraid to speak and act. Viola was distinguished by an openness rare for her time. She easily interacted with people from different social groups, without dividing people into us and them based on origin, skin color, age, or profession. Detroit, where she lived, was a city of contrasts: industrial, noisy, filled with social problems, immigration, and racial conflict. And while many preferred to stick within their own circles, Viola freely mingled with those others whispered about. She took children to schools with diverse ethnic compositions, participated in community programs to help the underprivileged, and often stayed after her shift to assist those who found it difficult to navigate bureaucratic matters. It was during these years that her concept of equality, one that didn't fit within the traditional framework of her surroundings, finally took shape. There was no talk of political struggle in the Liuzzo household. No one pushed her toward social activism. And yet, an inner need to stand up, to defend those she considered vulnerable, was born within Viola. This wasn't something sudden. Rather, it was a gradual, almost imperceptible process. The older she grew, the more she encountered injustice on a daily basis, the stronger her convictions became. The more involved she became in public life, the clearer it became that Viola's emotional and moral energy was directed toward supporting those who were most in need. She was the person whose door was always open. Neighbors came for advice, asked for help with paperwork, to borrow money until payday, to babysit. And almost every time, she helped. Anthony sometimes said her heart was too big and that one day she'd tire of carrying the entire neighborhood. But Viola only smiled because she felt she was doing what she had to. The children grew up, and family life was busy but stable. The Liuzzo home was a typical working-class home: a small living room, children's rooms where toys occasionally ended up scattered throughout the apartment, a kitchen table that served as a place for dinner, children's crafts, homework, and endless conversations between adults. Viola tried to ensure that her children grew up confident that any path was open to them. She often told them that education would give them what she hadn't had in her youth: the opportunity to choose their own path without fear. In the early 1960s, she increasingly paid attention to the news. The growing struggle for civil rights, student protests, Martin Luther King's speech, the arrests of peaceful protesters. She saw the country changing, the tension in the air, as if a major, inevitable turning point was approaching. While many preferred to discuss events superficially or with apprehension, Viola looked deeper. She was interested not in the movement itself as a political structure, but in the human element of this struggle, the women and men who took to the streets not because of slogans, but because of the belief that equality for all could be achieved. With each passing year, her inner need to participate in social processes grew stronger. She read a lot, discussed things with friends, followed the news, and gradually she came to the conclusion that empathy alone was not enough. She believed that a person should be where they can make a real difference, and if someone is marching for their rights, if someone is suffering humiliation simply because they want to vote or attend a decent school, then anyone who can help should do so. But the decision to join the movement didn't come suddenly. It was the result of many years of reflection, conversations, and inner searching. She wanted her actions to be honest and sincere. She often told her friends that she didn't want to be an armchair activist who discussed injustice from the comfort of her own home. She wanted to be where hands-on work, a machine, energy, and the ability to work under pressure were needed. And that was her true self: practical, proactive, with an inner core that wasn't always apparent from the outside. Viola loved her family. She loved Detroit. She loved the opportunity to be part of a developing, albeit complex, society. But at the same time, she felt the country was on the brink of change, and that this change wouldn't happen on its own. An inner voice urged her to step outside her usual circle of concerns. She felt her place was with those who fought not for their own gain, but for universal justice. And by the mid-1960s, this idea had become so clear to her that ignoring it would have been like denying her true nature. Viola Liuzzo, wife, mother, student, worker, neighbor, friend, became someone who felt that when the country was fighting for equal rights, her place was not on the sidelines. On March 25, 1965, the day officially ended in Alabama, but not in reality. The march from Selma to Montgomery had concluded, the column had reached the Capitol building, the speeches had been made, and the cameras had finished filming. However, for those responsible for logistics and security, the most tense part began precisely after the crowds began to disperse. In the evening, the center of gravity shifted from the squares and steps to the road, Interstate 80, which carried people back to Selma and to nearby towns and villages. By this point, Viola Liuzzo was no longer just a participant, but part of an unofficial transportation system that relied on volunteers with their own cars. For several days, she drove people in her 1963 Oldsmobile, from churches to rally points, from makeshift camps to the stretches of road where columns were forming. On the day of the march, her car was practically never idle. She picked up people where public transportation ended and took them to places buses couldn't or didn't have time to go. By the evening of March 25th, the work wasn't finished. After the rally in Montgomery, hundreds of people needed to be returned to Selma and other points in between. Organized transportation was fully utilized, but there were always those who couldn't get a seat. For such cases, volunteer drivers were available. Viola was one of them. She made several trips between road sections and accommodations, picking up those left on the side of the road with bags, posters, and fatigue from the hours-long march. Somewhere between 8 and 9 p.m., when daylight had completely faded and the dark southern night had settled over the road, Viola was near the exit from Montgomery toward Selma. She received information that there were still people who needed transport and agreed to make an additional trip. At one of the meeting points, she met 19-year-old Leroy Mouton, a young African-American man participating in the march. He needed to get back to Selma. The buses were full, some had already left, and the chances of leaving in an organized manner were dwindling. The decision was made quickly. Viola had a free car. Leroy needed to get back. They got into an Oldsmobile, she at the wheel, he in the passenger seat. From the outside, it looked like a normal episode in the general process of people returning from a major event. Viola drove carefully, maintaining a safe speed. She had spent many hours behind the wheel in recent days and knew that her attention now depended not only on her own safety, but also on that of her passenger. Signs of the recent march remained on the road. Here and there, people could still be seen on the shoulders, vans with organization logos, temporary signs, and posters not yet removed by volunteers. At the same time, another car was traveling along the same highway, a car carrying 4 men. All of them were affiliated with the local Ku Klux Klan. For them, the night after the march was not a time to return home, but a continuation of the standoff. They hit the road with their own goals and a mood far removed from reconciliation or observation. The men's attention was drawn to a car with northern license plates, driven by a white woman and a young African-American man in the passenger seat. This occupant, against the backdrop of the recently concluded march, was perceived by the radical Southerners not as a neutral fact, but as an irritant. The Klansman's car began to move within the Oldsmobile's line of sight, first at a distance, then closer. On the night highway, it looked like ordinary driving in the same lane. The headlights behind them could have meant anything to the driver, from a hitchhiker to a coincidental speed match. However, the car behind them remained persistent. It didn't overtake when possible, but it didn't fall behind either. as if tracking their every move. After a while, the car carrying the pursuers began to close the distance. Viola noticed the other car's unusual persistence. She tried changing speed, but the general pattern remained the same. The car continued to stay behind, then closed the distance again. At some point, the pursuing car attempted to overtake. This is a standard maneuver on a night road, but the duration and nature of the side-by-side movement created tension. The two cars ended up parallel, a short distance away. What happened next unfolded quickly. The car carrying the Klansmen approached the Oldsmobile enough to minimize the distance between them. They decided to use their weapons. Shots were fired from the window of the pursuing car toward the Oldsmobile. Everything happened almost instantly. Bright flashes, sharp sounds that tore through the night, and almost immediately, a loss of control of the car they were in. After the shooting began, the Oldsmobile stopped moving in the lane. The car abruptly changed trajectory, veering off the road and onto the shoulder. The shoulder of the highway in this section was uneven. Dirt, grass, possible bumps, and slight inclines. The out-of-control car first traveled along the crossing lane and then left the asphalt entirely. Its subsequent movement was accompanied by a dull, uneven noise as the tires bounced over the uneven surface. A few seconds after leaving the highway, the car collided with a guardrail, an old wooden fence that ran along part of the road. The impact struck the front of the car, the hood was deformed, and some of the fence boards were knocked out. The car carrying the attackers didn't stop there. It continued along the highway and left the section. There were no stops, no attempts to assess the consequences, no calls to the emergency services. For them, the episode on the road ended the moment Liuzzo's Oldsmobile left the highway. After some time, one of the drivers noticed the Oldsmobile. Based on the car's position, the direction of its headlights, and the lack of visible activity around it, he concluded that the situation warranted an investigation. However, given the state's current conditions and the nighttime hours, he decided not to stop next to the unknown vehicle on the deserted stretch of highway. The driver noted landmarks, the turnoff, the type of fence, the distance from the nearest settlement, and, having reached a location with access to a phone, reported the incident to local authorities. The dispatch unit received information. A vehicle had been spotted on a specific section of Highway 80, having left the road and crashed into a fence. The headlights were on. No one was visible around the vehicle. The call did not include the words shooting or assault. To an outside observer, it looked like a traffic accident with possible injuries. The dispatcher recorded the information and relayed the information to the patrol unit closest to the specified area. A patrol car was dispatched to the scene. The officers tasked with investigating the report had limited information. A vehicle had been spotted on the highway overnight, possibly involved in an accident. With mass events taking place throughout the region all day, police had already received several calls related to roads, transportation, and march participants. This call was perceived as another such incident. Driving along the highway, the patrol followed the instructions of the officer on duty and visual cues. At night, on a relatively dark stretch of road, the headlights of a car parked at an angle to the highway are visible from quite a distance. It was by this unusual beam pattern that the crew spotted the Oldsmobile. The patrol slowed and stopped at a safe distance, turning on its flashing lights and parking lights. The officers exited their patrol car. A preliminary assessment of the situation was completed at a distance of several dozen meters. The car was clearly parked facing a wooden barrier, part of which was damaged. The angle of the car's interior relative to the road clearly indicated it had veered off the road. As the officers approached, they noted the absence of any outward signs of human presence. No one was standing on the shoulder, waving or honking. There were also no other vehicles visible that could have stopped earlier. The situation appeared to be an isolated incident. One of the officers pointed a flashlight at the rear of the car, noting the license plate and the condition of the bodywork. The second officer moved toward the driver's door. Through the driver's door window, illuminated by the flashlight and headlights, the silhouette of a person in the front seat could be discerned. The person was sitting in the seat, close to the steering wheel with no visible activity. The officer paused, looking for any signs of movement. The second officer moved to the passenger side to get a better view of the rest of the car. From this angle, it became clear that there were not one, but two people inside, the driver and another figure closer to the passenger seat. At this stage, officers assumed they were dealing with an accident with possible injuries. Loss of consciousness from the impact, alcohol or other intoxication, a typical set of possibilities for a nighttime accident, could not be ruled out. However, even a closer look inside made it clear that the situation did not fit the standard scenario. Having decided to open the car, one of the officers pulled the driver's door handle. A woman was in the front seat. Her head was bowed, her body displaced. There were no visible attempts to move. A second person, a young man, was sitting nearby, on the passenger side inside the car. When the patrol arrived, he was alive, but his condition appeared to be extreme shock. The officers did not yet have a clear picture of the incident, but the combination of the car's position, the absence of signs of a struggle outside, the general appearance of the interior, and the condition of the occupants led them to conclude that this was not simply an accidental departure from the road. The officers relayed updated information to the duty station. A vehicle had been discovered that had left the highway and crashed into a barrier. Inside were a woman, unresponsive, and a man, in serious condition. Assistance from additional services was required. By this point, the crime scene had become a point requiring special attention. The patrol was maintaining a basic cordon, restricting unauthorized access, and maintaining as much stability as possible until other units arrived. It was at this point, on the side of Highway 80, after a late-night call, that police officers officially recorded the discovery of the body of a white female driver in a car involved in an incident on the highway following the march from Selma to Montgomery. The investigation into Viola Liuzzo's case began quickly, but from the very first hours it became clear that this was no ordinary accident on a nighttime highway. On the night of March 25 to 26, 1965, emergency services reported the body of a woman was found in a car that had slid off the road. On a normal day, this might have been classified as a fatal accident, but it was the night after the march from Selma to Montgomery, and all officials, police officers, and federal agents understood that any incident involving the marchers would automatically escalate into a different category. Information that the deceased was a white woman from Detroit assisting activists quickly reached state and federal authorities. Within the first few hours, not only local authorities but also the FBI were involved. For Washington, this episode was potentially explosive. A white woman, a mother of 5, was killed overnight on a southbound highway after a civil rights march, a combination of factors that could resonate far beyond Alabama. The scene was secured, and the patrol established a preliminary cordon. Viola's car was left undisturbed until the investigative team arrived. Illumination was provided by the headlights of their patrol cars and portable spotlights. The officers carefully inspected the highway, the shoulder, a section of the fence, and the interior itself. Even a cursory examination revealed that the theory of a simple accident was untenable. The damage to the car was inconsistent with the extent of the injuries seen on the woman behind the wheel. While striking a wooden fence could have caused the injuries, the nature of the damage pointed to another source. Forensic experts began their investigation. In the mid-1960s, the range of methods available was limited by today's standards, but even then, they knew how to inspect a car, record holes in the body, and look for signs of external impact. Inside, they found dents, damage, and holes in the metal and plastic that could not have been caused by a single collision with a fence. The pattern of these damages corresponded to an outside-in direction, from the left side, the side where another car was traveling parallel. While the car was being examined at the scene, preparations for the forensic examination began. Viola Liuzzo's body was officially removed from the car and taken to the morgue. It was crucial for authorities to obtain a definitive answer to two questions: the cause of death and the mechanism of events. They needed to determine what happened first, the car leaving the road or the impact on the body before losing control. Forensic experts began their work as quickly as possible. An examination of the external injuries from the very first stages provided a clear indication. The primary cause of death was not the impact with the fence. The primary focus was on the head injuries. They were localized and had clear contours, consistent with high-velocity projectiles rather than blunt objects, glass, or interior elements. The location of the injuries indicated that the impact occurred on the left side, at the level of the driver's window. The autopsy determined the fatal injury to be a gunshot wound. It became clear that after such an injury, the ability to drive could not have been maintained. Death occurred almost instantly, or within an extremely short period of time. Other injuries were also recorded, which also bore signs of a gunshot origin. The impact with the fence and subsequent movement along the shoulder could have further traumatized the body, but were not the primary cause. The official forensic conclusion was unequivocal. Viola Liuzzo died from shots fired from outside the car. This moved the case from the category of a traffic accident to that of intentional action. These conclusions were supported by forensic evidence from the Oldsmobile itself. Several holes were discovered in the body, doors, and interior trim, the shape and placement of which were consistent with bullet holes. Small metal fragments, likely projectile parts, were found inside the car. The trajectory they followed indicated an outside inward movement, at an angle consistent with the position of another car in the lane when driving parallel. In parallel with the work of forensic experts in the morgue and lab, investigators began interviewing Leroy Mouton, the only surviving eyewitness. His condition was unstable in the first hours: shock, fear, and emotional stress from the march and subsequent attack. Nevertheless, he was able to provide key information. According to him, he and Viola were driving along the highway when another car began following them. The car followed behind, then to the side, and remained nearby for some time. He observed several white men inside. At a certain point, gunfire erupted from their direction. Mouton said he heard loud bangs, felt the car jerk sharply, and then their car veered off the road and crashed into a fence. Investigators recorded every detail. They were interested in the appearance of the other car, the approximate number of people in it, the distance, and the moment the shooting began. Mouton could describe some of the silhouettes, but he had difficulty estimating the exact number. Nevertheless, he was clear. The shots did not come from inside or from the side of the road, but from the car next to him. Federal agents became actively involved in the investigation. By the end of the day after the incident, an FBI team was working in the region. The agency had its own network of informants, including within radical organizations. One of these informants was Gary Thomas Rowe, a member of the local Ku Klux Klan. At the time of the murder, he was in the very car from which, according to investigators, the shooting took place. His role was twofold. On the one hand, he was a participant in the crime. On the other, he was a source of information for federal authorities. During the investigation, specific names began to emerge: Eugene Thomas, Collis Ingrady, William Eaton, and the same Gary Thomas Rowe. All four were active members of the local Klan chapter. Their involvement in violent activities against civil rights supporters had been previously documented, but either lacked sufficient evidence for serious charges or remained under surveillance. The investigation carefully pieced together the pieces of the puzzle: interviews with residents who might have seen the Klansman's car that night, comparisons of Mouton's statements with descriptions of the suspect's vehicles, and an analysis of the timing and routes. All of this formed a pattern of events. At the same time, agents and local investigators were exploring other leads, formally exploring the possibility of an attack by random assailants or a domestic dispute unrelated to the clan. But with each passing day, it became clearer. The thread led directly to a specific group of radicals. The weapons were particularly important. There were plenty of people in the region who owned firearms, and their presence alone proved nothing. However, an investigation revealed that some of the suspects possessed weapons of a caliber matching the one allegedly used in the attack. Ballistics testing in 1965 wasn't as sophisticated as it is today, but even then, experts could compare the nature of damage, the shape of deformed shell fragments, and draw conclusions about the type of weapon. During questioning, Thomas, Ingrady, Eaton, and Rowe attempted to maintain the line that the night after the march, they were either at home or in another location unconnected to Highway 80 between Montgomery and Selma. However, an investigation revealed that such statements were not fully corroborated. Some witnesses in populated areas along the highway saw a car similar to theirs and overheard conversations and phrases expressing dissatisfaction with the march and its participants. The descriptions of the people in the car and the license plates partially matched what was known to the investigation. A key figure in this chain of events was Gary Thomas Rowe. His position was unique. He was both a participant in the events and a secret source of information for the FBI. For federal authorities, he was a valuable resource, but also a problematic element, as his presence in the car with the Klansmen at the time of the murder raised questions about the FBI's knowledge of the planned actions. During the murder investigation, Rowe provided testimony that became key to bringing charges against the other Klansmen. According to his version, on the night of the murder, the four were driving onto Interstate 80, watching for cars they believed might be carrying marchers. They spotted Viola Liuzzo's Oldsmobile with northbound license plates and saw that a white woman was driving it, with a young African-American man sitting next to her. This provoked a violent reaction. During the pursuit, according to Rowe, the decision was made to teach a lesson to those who, in their words, supported the troublemakers. He then described the moment when one of his companions pulled a gun and opened fire on Liuzzo's car. Rowe's testimony, despite its complexity and ambiguity, matched the forensic and crime scene evidence. The direction of the shots, the position of the car, and the trajectory of the car after the driver was struck. This became the missing link that connected the pieces of the puzzle. After the investigation had assembled a body of evidence, the forensic report, the car inspection, the ballistics findings, Leroy Mouton's testimony, the testimony of residents, and Rowe's confession, the time had come to formally pursue the suspects. Arrest warrants were soon issued for Eugene Thomas, Collis Ingrady, and William Eaton. At this point, Gary Thomas Rowe was formally considered a key witness, not the primary defendant. The arrest operation was carried out quickly and in a coordinated manner. The suspects were apprehended at their homes or familiar locations, leaving no time to coordinate leads or destroy potential evidence. The moment officers with warrants showed up on their doorsteps, the Viola Liuzzo case took a new turn. From an unknown highway attack to a criminal case with specific defendants, it was finally established. The arrest of the three Klansmen marked the formal conclusion of the initial investigation and simultaneously the beginning of the next stage, the trial, which will require not only proving guilt, but also withstanding the pressure of public opinion and the political context surrounding the murder. Since the arrest of Eugene Thomas, Collis Ingrady, and William Eaton, the Viola Liuzzo case rapidly shifted from a local investigation to a federal case with national resonance. The media had already called the murder one of the most emblematic crimes of racial hatred. A white woman from a northern state, who had volunteered to help the civil rights movement, murdered in the heart of the Old South. Alabama authorities, the federal government, and the FBI all understood that the trial would be under the microscope of public opinion. Formally, the first step was to proceed to state, not federal, court. Murder charges were filed under Alabama law. The defendants were accused of participating in the intentional killing of Viola Liuzzo. The key elements of the prosecution's case rested on a cumulative body of evidence: the medical examiner's report on the cause of death, the forensic analysis of the car, the testimony of Leroy Mouton, and especially the testimony of Gary Thomas Rowe, who, while still an FBI informant, effectively testified as an eyewitness from inside the attacker's car. The state trial unfolded in the usual manner for such cases. The prosecution constructed a chain of events. The night after the march, driving on Interstate 80, Liuzzo's Oldsmobile, the parallel car carrying the Klansman, the gunshots, driving off the road, hitting the fence, and Viola's death. At the center of the evidence was Rowe's testimony. He recounted how 4 men, Thomas, Ingrady, Eaton, and himself, were driving along the highway, spotted a car carrying a white woman and an African-American man, took it as a challenge, and began pursuing them. According to Rowe, there was a pronounced hostility inside the car toward those they considered troublemakers. During the drive, he said, one of the co-defendants pulled a gun and opened fire on Liuzzo's car. His account matched the trajectory of the wounds, the direction of the damage to the bodywork, and Leroy Mouton's testimony. For prosecutors, this was a tie, independent sources matching their descriptions of key incidents. The defense relied on discrediting witnesses. The main goal was to undermine Rowe's credibility. The lawyers pointed out that he himself was an active member of the Ku Klux Klan, that he was present in the car, and that his cooperation with the FBI could have motivated him to shift primary responsibility to others in order to preserve his own freedom. Any inconsistencies in his previous testimony, any clarifications that emerged later, were used as arguments. This man was saying what suited the federal authorities. Leroy Mouton was also the target of equally discrediting attempts. The defense reminded the jury that he was a marcher, a man associated with the civil rights movement. His position was portrayed as politically motivated, that is, biased against local whites. Any inaccuracy in timing, distances, the number of shots fired, any retelling of the story that deviated from the previous one was used to create doubt. The state's context also played a role. In the mid-1960s, juries in Alabama were composed almost exclusively of white people. This meant that decades of ingrained stereotypes entered the courtroom, along with the defendants. For many, the Ku Klux Klan was perceived not as a terrorist group, but as a radical, yet in-law group. The idea that Klan members could cold-bloodedly shoot a white woman for helping black people was uncomfortable for some members of the public and provoked internal resistance. During the oral arguments, the defense repeatedly emphasized the lack of perfect physical evidence directly linking the recovered shell fragments to the specific weapons of specific defendants. They cited the technical limitations of ballistics and possible errors in evidence collection. They noted that no weapon was found in Liuzzo's car, but this, by their logic, didn't prove who fired the shots from outside, only that someone had fired. As a result, despite the magnitude of the evidence and political expectations, the state jury returned a not guilty verdict on the murder charge. The jury found insufficient direct evidence to convict Thomas, Ingrady, and Eaton of murder under Alabama law. For the Liuzzo family, the civil rights movement, and federal authorities, this decision was a blow, but partly predictable. The local judicial system, almost entirely dependent on the white electorate, was not yet ready to openly convict in a Klan-related case. However, the prosecution didn't end there. Almost in parallel with the state trial, the U.S. Department of Justice was preparing a different strategy: federal charges. If murder could not be proven under Alabama law, there remained a tool increasingly used in hate crime cases: civil rights charges. Legally, these were different offenses, and they were tried in the federal system, with different procedures and a different degree of influence from Washington. Federal prosecutors filed charges against the same 3 defendants, Eugene Thomas, Collis Ingrady, and William Eaton, for conspiracy to deprive a citizen of constitutionally guaranteed rights by force, resulting in death. The gist of the matter was that the attackers intentionally targeted and attacked people for participating in lawful activities related to the civil rights movement, thereby violating their federal rights to freedom of movement and protection from the state. The federal trial took place in a different atmosphere. Here, the influence of local stereotypes was still felt, but the role of federal norms and standards was significantly greater. The name of Gary Thomas Rowe was again heard in the courtroom. His testimony once again became the basis for reconstructing the events. But now it was viewed not only through the prism of whether he himself was the killer, but as part of a pattern of organized action by a group aimed at undermining civil rights. This time, the emphasis was not only on the moment of the shooting, but also on the motivation. The phrase racially motivated murder was used directly. The defense tried to use previous arguments, discrediting Rowe, doubting the accuracy of Mouton's testimony, and attempting to portray the events as a chaotic incident without a clear political motive. The federal court ultimately saw the actions of the three defendants as not simply participation in a tragic episode, but a deliberate conspiracy. Unlike a state jury, the evidence here was evaluated more rigorously, taking into account the context, the systematic nature of attacks on civil rights activists, the practice of radical groups visiting highways after rallies, the circle of acquaintances, and the defendant's Klan affiliation were all taken into account. When the verdict arrived, attention was focused not only on the courtroom, but also on the entire country. The decision was intended to demonstrate the extent to which the federal system was prepared to truly protect civil rights, not in pleadings, but in a specific case involving the death of a specific woman. A federal court found Eugene Thomas, Collis Ingrady, and William Eaton guilty of conspiring to deprive Viola Liuzzo of her civil rights by using deadly force. Each was sentenced to up to 10 years in prison. Technically, it wasn't a case of murder in the strict legal sense, but rather a violation of federal civil rights. However, in essence, this was the only real sentence the system could deliver for Viola Liuzzo's death. Thus, the trial ended in a dichotomy. The state court acquitted the defendants of murder, but the federal court convicted them of a civil rights crime, finding it an organized, hate-motivated attack on a woman who was volunteering and using her car to help people return home after the Selma march.